You're listening to Write Right with the Story Perfect Editing team. Visit us at www.storyperfectediting.com for more information on developmental editing, copy editing, and proofreading services for your writing. Season 1, Episode 7. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Write Right podcast with the Story Perfect Editing team. Last time we talked about your first time with an editor, and editors are focused on rules. But this time we're going to talk about when you can break the rules, because that's a really important piece of the writing puzzle. But first, we're going to introduce ourselves. I am Elon. I am an apprentice editor with Story Perfect. And John, who's going to be up next, will tell you all about himself.
Well, I'm John, and I am the senior editor and the guy who keeps things together sometimes. So,
I'm Katie. I am the, chief copy editor and only copy editor at Story Perfect. Of course.
I'm Dale. I'm still a junior editor, surprisingly, but I'm keeping it in there. So, yep, and yeah.
Still, only 2 weeks, and here you are, still a junior editor. What happened to your meteoric rise, Dale?
Stardom fades.
He's just waiting till he can be senior editor, and I'll be the underdog.
This mutiny has been long in the works.
And I'm Ian. I am an apprentice editor still, sadly.
It's an okay club to
But
be
you're
in.
learning lots.
We're together.
Elon, what are you reading, Elon?
What am I reading? So I told you about Central Station a couple weeks ago, which was awesome. I'm still reading that book, Reading Like a Writer by Francine Prose and Naaman's, which is amazing, which is just a spectacular book. I'm also currently listening because audible.com provides me with my Warbler project with audiobooks, which is like the coolest thing that's ever happened to me, except the other stuff. So Audible sent over this book called Octavia's Brood, which is a series of short sci-fi stories from active social justice activists, particularly in the Black community. It is a book. The reason it's called Octavia's Brood is because they are all inspired by Octavia Butler, a tremendously skilled sci-fi writer from like the 70s and 80s, who was also very focused on social justice, particularly for people of color. The anthology is really interesting because it features a lot of writers who were activists first, many of whom had never written science fiction, and so you get this sort of full gamut from really skilled sci-fi writers to someone who's never been in the genre, and you can see sort of how ideas manifest for people of different skill levels with sci-fi. It's a great anthology. I highly recommend it. The reader is also really good. So if you want to get it on Audible, you should go do that.
Cool.
Who's next, John?
Well, I am still reading Lord of the Rings. Let me talk about how I read. I because I'm so busy in the day, I set times aside. I tend to read in the morning and in the evening. So in the morning, I'm working my way through fantasy books. That's going to be my little fun adventure over the next year or two. And I'm Lord of the Rings, probably Harry Potter next. I want to return to a lot of my core influences. And in the evening, I tend to read craft books. I mentioned Stephen James' Story Trumps Structure. I'm kind of bouncing between that and another book called Successful Self-Publishing by Joanna Penn. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This book, if you haven't heard of Joanna Penn, go and check her out. It's thecreativepenn.com. She is on a mission to help and empower self-publishing authors, just in terms of all the different things out there to help you put out the best book possible. And this book is free, and she lays out all the different things that you need to do in order to successfully self-publish a book.
Nice.
I'm reading it for personal interest. My book, Blood Dawn, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time perfecting it before it goes anywhere, but I want to know a little bit about that myself. But on the other hand, this is a great chance to announce some news about our company. We recently incorporated, so we're actually a corporate company called Story Perfect Inc. So Story Perfect Editing Services is now a division of that corporation. And we are going to be expanding to help authors who are self-publishing. So we're going to get into doing some things like covers, book formatting, and media kits for authors, among other things. So reading this is also a great way for me to know what kind of things authors need, so we could look at doing more than just editing. But we're going to specialize here as Story Perfect. So,
Yeah.
Katie.
I'll drink to that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm going to read that next. After I'm done with this book, which actually I just finished like yesterday. I finished it for a book club. It's called The Unit by Ninni Holmqvist. And it is a Nordic sci-fi book. It's marketed as sci-fi, although I will say I felt it was more of a drama. It was just sort of like against the backdrop of some dystopian society. But it was really... I want to say it was just very like socially topical and interesting. It's sort of similar to Logan's Run, but is much shorter and much more to the point. And also it's a translated book because it was originally in Swedish, I think. So it's just always really interesting to me to read books that have been translated. Usually I like to read them in languages where I speak both, so I can compare. This one I don't, but there are clear cultural differences, so you wonder, like, oh, I didn't really like that. And you're like, I don't know, maybe that's just how it is in Sweden. I don't know. So it was a really fun read, but it was also like a very sad dystopian novel, which it's been rainy here, so I was in the mood for it, you know. What about you, Dale?
Me? I'm still reading kind of boring books as usual. I'm still reading classics on organization theory, 6th edition. So
Oh, the 6th edition.
Yeah,
that really improved upon the issues with the 5th.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, you get one more title. It's something called, I don't know right now, and I don't care that much, but it's a good book. It's a good book.
You're getting smarter as you read it.
The truest student.
But in all honesty, like, okay, apart from that book.
Oh no, we have swears.
No, we'll cancel that out. Yeah, but aside from that book, yes, exactly. Apart from that book, I've actually recently bought this, James Joyce's Ulysses, considered the greatest novel in English literature.
My mother
and the hardest to read.
Master's thesis about Ulysses.
So. Katie, were you saying something?
Oh. No, Ulysses is great.
You don't have to.
Okay.
I mean, get in there with it, Katie.
I just think that Ulysses is a book people, sometimes you're like, this is a classic, and then you read it and you're like, what the heck is going on here? James Joyce? No, I don't think it's the greatest book. I think it is a book that people write papers over. I think it's a really good academic book because there's a lot to write about, but it's not a fun read. It's not that, like...
It's not
a good
I just bought it.
I would love to go deeper into this kind of conversation sometime, because this idea that books are objectively important does not necessarily mean they're good subjectively.
Yeah.
Future
episode. When I was in college, I had all these English major friends who were like, "Oh, but these are the books that my professor believes to be the greatest of all books." And I'm like, "Yeah, but do you believe that? I don't believe that. The greatest book is actually,
let me tell you that I had a lot of academic proposals turned down because there wasn't enough works I could cite in my work. They're like, you can't talk about this topic because you don't have any references. And I'm like, doesn't that mean it's an important topic? Like, no one has talked about it yet. And to me, that meant, yeah, I should cover it. But because I couldn't cite other important scholars who had worked on it, I wasn't able to get it approved. Which to me was just the whole system. I was against the man. I went very Fight Club. I disappeared for a few years.
It sounds like to me, Katie, you were breaking the rules.
Oh my god, I was!
Why?
Yes, I was breaking the rules. I was breaking them gladly.
So yeah, that can lead us super smoothly into our topic for today's podcast, which, I remind you listeners, is breaking the rules. So grammar, it's a system of rules, and they govern critical elements of how we communicate. Even if we don't think about them consciously while we talk to each other, grammar plays a huge role in how we process language as it comes into us. We can hear commas as pauses and periods. We can even sometimes hear semicolons. We can hear parentheticals. And so the same thing takes place when we read a book. We read it out loud in our own heads, and grammar really helps us to pace the story. Some rules, however, can be broken, while others absolutely cannot. And we're going to talk today if the same is true of grammar when writing fiction. And that answer isn't exactly yes, and it isn't exactly no. And I think, as John was saying before we hit record here, it's gonna spark perhaps some interesting debate. To begin, Ian brought up something interesting before the podcast started, and that was about dialogue, where all rules are broken and nothing matters. And
whose line is it anyway?
Yeah, totally right. The point, what is it? The points are made up and the rules don't matter.
Yeah, the points are made up and the rules don't matter.
It's a great show. But we're going to save dialogue for another conversation, another podcast episode, because it's such a big topic. So what we're going to focus on is grammar in narration, grammar outside of the scope of dialogue, and just talk about whether or not and how rules can be broken. I've spoken enough. I'm going to hand it over to you guys.
I mean, I'll just start by saying that it largely depends on your narrator. So if you have a first-person narration, then the rules... You're not necessarily breaking them, but the rules are different for you. So if you're writing a fantasy book that's in first person and he's like a 60-year-old wizard, then clearly like the things you expect from him and the things he is able to do are different than like a first person children's book where the protagonist is 12. Like the rules for vocabulary are different based on the reader's expectations. And what you don't want to do, like, it's good to challenge readers' expectations, but not to the point where they're taken out of your fiction. Like, why would a 12-year-old know such, like, $5 words if you don't want to be throwing vocabulary that's inappropriate in? Because you don't want people constantly questioning your logic. You want them to just question, like, ooh, I didn't expect that, and that was fun. You don't want them, like, just antagonizing over every detail. You have to go with the rules for the most part, so that when you break a rule, it's clear that you did it on purpose and for effect.
Yeah, the rule that I like to use when deciding whether or not the rules should be broken is it clear in what you've done that in itself is a rule? So you're trumping. I thought about that before I said it because I wanted to make sure I didn't trip on my tongue. But I mean, that's the idea that it's you're sort of pulling a trump card, and the reader should be able to see that and appreciate it and feel like it's actually part of the rules that you're laying out and saying. I mean, in a way, when you write a story, you're kind of playing a game with the reader, saying, and this is what you can expect of me. You're setting up expectations. So we all know the rules of grammar and kind of have that from our experience from reading articles, reading books. And so if you're going to set something different up, you just better make sure that that's clear to the reader. Don't suddenly change your double quotation marks in dialogue to single quotation marks later on just because you want to.
Yeah, it has no effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are
unless it's a parallel.
Bigger, like someone who like speaks wrong or something like that, or has like a weird like neurological issue. That maybe then you can break weird rules like that. But like,
I would still change it in copy editing.
Of course.
Would you say that breaking grammar rules is only confined to specifically first-person narrations?
If it's in third person and you're breaking grammatical rules, I think it will pull the reader out, because third person, even if it's close third, I think you just can't really do it in third effectively. And I could be wrong, but I just haven't seen any good examples of it. I've seen it happen, but never really with any impact.
Yeah,
for sure. I think.
Sorry. Go for it, Dale.
Sorry, I wanted to say that the only time where a third-person narration actually works for breaking grammar rules is when it's not necessarily fiction, but actually just poetry.
Right. Poetry doesn't even have grammar. It's just like words and spaces and put a semicolon in it. Woo!
Yeah.
And I can say that because I am a poet and I'm a published poet, and I can say that no one cares where you put semicolons in poetry, and it's beautiful.
Well, one of the nice things about poetry is that the physical shape of the written words it plays a role.
And I will say I have seen fiction that does that, and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
But it is not. It's the exception that proves the rule, I think.
In some,
Go for it.
In some cases, isn't first-person narration kind of like mental dialogue in itself?
Yeah, usually.
Yeah, that sort of leads into what I was about to say, Ian. That's a perfect segue, which was that these decisions are about character voice, and so when you're in first person, you're much closer to internal monologue, and you are going to be reflecting that choice with grammar and with diction, with vocabulary. In third person, you still give character voice, but it's slightly more distant, and so those decisions are largely vocabulary based as opposed to grammatical. Because you can be super in character with third person. I mean, read the entire Wheel of Time. That there's a bunch of different characters, and they all talk very differently, but it's all in third person. And people's opinions of the quality of those books notwithstanding, that's a pretty undeniable fact that there's a lot of different vocal changes in a third-person manuscript, a multi-POV third-person manuscript. So these are the kinds of decisions that affect how people will read your characters in their heads. And out loud. I've said this before on the podcast, but I really encourage everyone when you're writing fiction to read your work out loud, even if especially if you stumble over it, you'll be like, oh, maybe someone will stumble over that at some point. I've certainly written unwieldy sentences only discovered them after reading them aloud, especially like reading them to someone. So I'll write something and I'll be like, hey, to my girlfriend, I'll be like, hey, Crystal, can I just read you something real quick? And even if she listens with half an ear, the action of reading it aloud to a listener to try to convey that emotion and stuff, it really comes through how I've written the grammar out and which rules I've decided to enforce.
Yeah, well, and I mean, just even outside of grammar rules, there are like craft rules, right? And craft rules are interesting because the short of it is that if you want to be published by the big 5 traditional publishers, you can't break craft rules. Your book has to be formed from A to B like all the other books on the shelf at Barnes & Noble, and that's just what they want, and that's fine. There are a lot of really great books written that way, but if you want to break those rules, you have to realize that you're going to be on like a little lonely island. And books that are written outside of those rules often win awards but they have to be really, really great. There's just there's no middle ground with breaking the rules. It's like, I read this book called No One Is Ever Missing. And the way that it broke the rules is that nothing happened. It was just internal, like, monologue. There was no event. There was no like arch. It was just like her on a road trip looking at stuff. But you go on like an emotional journey with her as she thinks that's like you just wouldn't expect. And it won some awards, and I really loved reading it, but I couldn't read more than one book like that probably. Like I would be like, this one was good, and then that the standard is so high that you just can't have too many books that break those rules.
Yeah, everything down the road from that employs the same techniques will just like feel derivative.
Exactly.
So there's like this sort of mainstream center of the road type of manuscript. I would love to hear more about these craft rules sort of in detail. I think that would really be helpful. I think you're talking about like a 3-act, or like a 3 or 5-act story. Like, you follow these sort of traditions. There's
up to the like denouement kind of deal.
You follow Joseph. What is it? What's his name?
I don't know who we're talking about, Elon.
Joseph.
And his Technicolor
Different. I'm trying to not forget the hero with 1,000 faces.
I don't know.
What genre?
It's not a genre. He was a researcher. He studied mythology.
Okay. Yeah. No.
What's the dude's name?
Joseph.
It's probably
History
not
of Joseph. to be solved next time.
Joseph Campbell, not I was going to say Joseph Smith. That's the Mormon guy, and that's like a totally different kettle of fish. Joseph Campbell.
He broke all the rules in his book. I'll say that.
Joseph Campbell or Joseph Smith. Yeah, there's a lot of rules broken with that. Our critique of Mormonism next episode.
Yeah. The episode that didn't get uploaded.
Actually,
the rules are breaking craft rules is more risky than breaking grammar rules because if you break craft rules, it can largely affect whether you are published or not. If you're aiming to be published by a publisher, if you're self-publishing, you have a lot more freedom to break rules and make artistic choices. And I think that's kind of awesome because there is so little acceptance of it in the big publishing world. Like they want what they want. They want books that fit this mold. And like I said,
sell, right? And then until someone writes, the next, The Martian or whatever it was, which didn't even break any rules. It was just published differently.
Didn't really break any rules. Was just good. Was just a good book.
Was just good. But like then, the big five, someone from the big publishing houses will pick it up and say, okay, cool. Now we can publish this kind of book because there's a proven success.
There's already an audience for it. Yeah. So you do take risks if you're breaking craft rules can mean weird POV choices. Elon, I think you mentioned that you read a book that was third person and then switched to first.
Yeah. I hate when you do that.
The Name of the Wind does that.
It's
brilliantly.
It's a fantastic story.
Yeah, I mean that's breaking the rule. I mean
he doesn't do it. Oh, sorry. Go on, Katie.
Okay. I'm just saying that in a developmental edit, that's something we would say like, "Oh, I don't know if you should do that," right? But clearly, it worked really well.
I think that if The Name of the Wind was done entirely in first person, without the sort of that larger framework, that larger setting of like the story being told in a pub, I think that it would be a lot harder to commit to following the slower moments in the story, because that other adventures are going to happen. You've heard the main character call these other names. You have an idea that it's going to go somewhere. So when there's a slower sequence that takes place, you're like, I'm still in it. I know he's going to become the Bloodless. How does he do that? And then he does that, and you're like, I knew that was going to happen somehow. I knew something was going to go down there. And so. Yeah, it was a super weird thing to do, and it was only done correctly because of a lot of really careful consideration. I think that Pat Rothfuss put in like an enormous amount of work to make that book work. And
14 years of time.
The proof is in the pudding. I mean, it is such an extraordinarily good book. It's such a fantastic read that... Yeah, man. I just hope he doesn't take 14 years for the next one, but if he needs it, I'll keep watching him on Steam or on Twitch, like whatever. No worries.
I think he actually spent the 14 years, he wrote the entire trilogy. He spent 7 years doing that, and then he spent an additional 7 years perfecting the first book. So I think the others will come quicker. Yeah. But I mean, that's the type of commitment you should put into something. I mean, if your scope is that big, if you're trying to write the next Lord of the Rings, you can't expect you're going to pop that off in a year. You know, that's, I mean, you can try, but you're probably going to end up competing with a lot of the other epic fantasy fiction out there, which is a lot of people saying, hey, I wrote a great fantasy book. It's going to be the next Lord of the Rings. And a lot of people are doing that. So if you want to stand apart,
they have, like maps and elves and dwarves, which doesn't actually, that's not actually what made Lord of the Rings Lord of the Rings. It was its scope, it was its focus, it was a lot of different things. But
well,
I actually have a question.
Go ahead, Dale.
Yeah, I'm wondering. Okay, when a piece of work actually breaks the craft rules of its genre or just in general, how do you know if it's good or if it's just garbage per se?
Trust your
really
editor.
Good question.
I mean, I'm to your editor.
I mean, I think for me the rule is, so I read this book that was in first person, but it was like it was the book I just mentioned, The Unit. It's in first person. It's fine. Like, it's exactly what you expect out of first person. Like, I walked into the room, I looked over here, I felt this, like normal first person. And then 80% of the way through the book, she talks to the reader. She says, and now I need you to do this. And I was like, whoa! But it made me like excited, I was like, yeah. So if it makes you feel good, then they did it right. Like that's sort of the simplest answer. Is like,
is there a science to it though, per se?
Yeah, there is.
I think one key thing with regard to that, this kind of topic's been floating around in my head for our whole episode here. Your audience, know your audience. That is the biggest thing. A lot of writers sit down and write, and they only think about themselves and how they feel about what they write. But that doesn't mean anything. I mean, in a way, the most important skill you can gain as a writer is to see what you're writing, how your audience is going to see it. And when you can separate yourself from that, that's great. Now, unfortunately, it's impossible to do that perfectly, which is why having an editor helps. Mm-hmm. Editor, beta readers who are in your target audience allows you to know, are you hitting the right notes? Or are you way off? So like Katie, great example, you shared a reaction. And so for that author, if that's what they were intending to do, they're going to totally break the rules, but they had that effect where the reader went, whoa, that's what you want to do. Well, that's great. Say you make a character, a common problem that I think a lot of editors see as unlikable characters who you just hate and you don't want to have anything to do with. Well, you're not going to read that book because you're going to get bored. And because you're not connecting to them, you don't care about what happens. So how can you deal with that and make sure that what's happening is still going to engage the reader? I mean, good example is Jaime Lannister in Game of Thrones. He became a point of view character. He's an awesome character. Like, I love his chapters. Cersei became a point of view character, and I love her chapters too. But I mean, again, the thing is relatable. George R.R. Martin makes those characters relatable, so that even though we may not think they're good people, we at least understand what drives them. So we in some kind of way root for them.
Because it allows us to engage with them.
Yeah, we see where they're broken, and that little wicked part of us that all exists in every one of us that we kind of relate to that, saying, well, if I wasn't a good person, if I was bad and selfish, like I'd lay waste to all my enemies and scheme and destroy them. There's that. It's a way to connect to the reader, and if you don't present that, it's not going to work. So that's just.
There's another podcast that I listen to. Sorry, Katie. That is, it's called Writing Excuses. Many of you have probably heard of it. It's Brandon Sanderson, Mary Robinette Kowal, Dan Wells, and Howard Taylor. A bunch of established creatives in writing, and one of them is in comics. But one thing that they talk about, which I think is really like apropos Dale's question and Katie's answer, is they talk about sort of hacking the brain of your audience, and that's what writing is. Mm-hmm. You are inputting a bunch of information to achieve a result, and that result is an emotional impact or of any kind. It could be joy, surprise, horror, fear, adventure, adrenaline rush, arousal, whatever it is that you want to achieve in your reader. You are putting in a bunch of data to elicit a result, and like, it's not a perfect analogy because, if you're trying to hack something, you can't break a lot of rules. You have to know the rules well enough to work around them, which I think is another great way of looking at this. You know the rules well enough to say, I want to achieve this thing. I'm going to break the fourth wall 80% of the way through the book and achieve this sense of wow, surprise, and joy in the reader that, gets them further invested into the story. And other rules can be broken as well. Like there's this kind of like the thing that happens for me in the Pat Rothfuss book where he breaks from third to first person is there's this kind of like large focus. And then when he sits down to begin telling the story, there's almost like a physical feeling that my brain is going further into the page. And I'm going a layer deeper into the story. And I feel like I'm there in the present moment listening to a story being told about the past, which is a really, really cool feeling for me as a reader. And that somehow manages to permeate the entirety of a 700-page book.
I mean, the most objective test, Dale, to say, like, is this working, is this not working? And this really applies on a larger scale. This applies to books on, like, the basest of level, like, for a character or a scene. It's like, is the book the same without it? So if there's if the author never talks to me, do I feel the same way? No, right? Like, and in some ways, like, the breaking of the rules for the most part is about eliciting reader feeling, or signifying a change somehow, and that matters to the reader. So yeah, I mean, if it feels the same without it, then it doesn't work, and it just wasn't effective. But really following the rules really well and then breaking it makes you as a reader know that they did it on purpose, and that makes you think like, what are they trying to do here, right? And if you don't already know, which probably you do, but
that's a really great point. My thought just evaporated. We are at about 25 minutes. So let's do like a quick ad. We are Story Perfect. We edit books. We are now part of Story Perfect Inc., but we are Story Perfect Editing Services, and we edit long form, short form, whatever you like. And we really love fiction, so please send us some to edit. I want to keep this conversation going because I'm super interested in it. I think that the point that we've come to essentially is this idea that, yes, you can break the rules for the right reason and for the right to elicit the right outcome. If you're breaking the rules for the sake of breaking the rules, just for the sake of sort of like, oh, look how different I am,
Ulysses,
I don't use periods, like, oh, look at me, I can also just like make unwieldy run-on sentences. That's not really going to make anyone go, that author knew something because that author didn't use punctuation correctly. What is going to make a huge difference is something that's going to make your reader stop and say, wow, that author got something through to me that I didn't expect. And that should be what you're trying to achieve with all of your work, regardless of if you want to write just like a plain adventure story or like an exciting mystery or a spy novel or like an essay about the efficacy of food substitutes. Like whatever it is, you want to achieve something that is bigger than the work in your reader. You want them to agree with you about something. You want them to go on this ride with you. You want them to be surprised and awed. You want them to feel the majesty of an enormous city that doesn't really exist. You want them to feel the fear that your character fears when the Lovecraftian horror shows up in their house. And if you need to break the rules to achieve those things, then go for it and talk to an editor afterwards, because they'll be able to be like, hey, that was a really cool thing. I support this, but let's figure out how to fix this to make it as tight and as effective as possible.
I will say that although the breaking craft rules is riskier, I am more supportive of that than of breaking like grammar rules, because I find that breaking grammar rules doesn't generally have like a huge emotional affect. The only time I can think where it was effective is probably The Sound and the Fury, which is a Faulkner novel, and he has different POVs, and there's one character that doesn't have punctuation or not much, and it's really confusing until you realize that it's a person who is like mentally handicapped, and then you think like, oh, this is like stream of consciousness. That's why there's no like real punctuation. That's why it sounds like this. But that goes back to the idea that like it's character specific.
Yep.
So I'm mostly against breaking grammar rules as a copy editor because I'll want to fix them. But
yeah, and the great thing about having a copy editor go over that, even if you're intentionally doing it, is you have that moment, like sort of like you're playing devil's advocate and saying, well, this is the rule, you're breaking that rule. And then the author can decide, do they really want to do this?
Exactly.
Or not?
Yeah, but like John said earlier in the podcast, it's really critical to still have a set of beta readers, to still have a set of editors, to have people read your work that are interested in your genre, that can help you sort of determine if those decisions you made to break these overarching sort of rules or these specific grammar rules is effective and is achieving the result that you're aiming for. We are about at 27 minutes, so I want to start cutting off the podcast. Does anyone have anything they want to add? Final thoughts. Does everyone agree with Katie that we should err on the side of, or not err on the side of anything, that we should be as close as possible to grammatical rules? Is that?
I'll say that unless your character is mentally handicapped in any way, like the character from Flowers for Algernon,
right?
That's another great example.
Stick with what Katie said, which is keep it simple, keep it clean, and keep to the rules.
My closing remark would be always tell the story no matter what, and make yourself disappear. So when the reader reads the story, they're reading the story, and you're not involved. You just translated let the narrator do their thing. And so if the story calls for breaking of the rules, then that's part of it. But if it's just because you want to mess around and show how smart you are, or whatever, I mean, if that's what happens when you're breaking the rules, that's going to come across.
Yeah.
For sure.
Ian, any final thoughts?
Going back to having the narrator in the story, like what John just said, what about Lemony Snicket? I mean, he put himself into the story, like Daniel Handler, like as the person following the orphans around, creepily documenting their lives. I mean,
I would say that's part of the story. I mean, because that way that story is told, it's in the nature of how he does it. The voice, the narration, that's part of it. That you feel like. I mean, as long as you establish that that's the rule and that's how the story is being told, then it's clear. Yeah. But what I mean when I say make yourself invisible is don't let the reader kind of see a writer trying to pull off certain things. It should be part of how the story wants to be told. All right.
Yeah, to that same effect, I think my parting thought would just be that each work has its own set of rules. They're the rules that you establish for it, and those are the rules you need to follow. You need to be consistent with whether you're breaking rules or, setting new POVs or changing the way you use grammar. The more consistent you are, the more purposeful it is and more impactful. So keep to the set of rules, whether that's, the larger set of rules or your specific set of rules. Like, it's just the work itself needs to stand alone without your help, without you explaining what you were trying to do, like John said.
That's a really good way of putting it. So that just about puts us 30 minutes. I want to say thank you very much to our podcasters. Again, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you, listeners, for joining us, as always. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Tune in next time and go to storyperfectediting.com for all of your editorial needs.